13. On a grayish-blue rink where there were tennis courts in summers lightly powdered with snow, the townsfolk were disporting themselves cautiously, and at the very moment the Luzhins passed by on their morning stroll, the sprightliest of skaters, a bewestered young fellow, gracefully launched into a Dutch step and sat down hard on the ice. Farther, in a small public garden, a 3-year-old boy in all red, walking unsteadily on woolen legs, made his way to a stirrup stone, scraped off with one fingerless little hand some snow that was lying there in an appetizing hillock, and raised it to his mouth, for which he was immediately seized from behind and spanked. "Oh, you poor little thing," said Miss Luzhin, looking back. A bus went along the whitened asphalt, leaving 2 thick black stripes behind it. From a shop of talking and playing machines came the sound of fragile music, and someone closed the door so the music would not catch cold. A dachshund with a patched blue little overcoat and low swinging ears stopped and sniffed the snow, and Miss Luzhin had time to stroke it. Something light, sharp, and whitish kept striking them in the face, and when they appeared at the empty sky, bright specks danced before their eyes. Miss Luzhin skidded and looked reproachfully at her gray snow boots. By the Russian food store they met the Alferov couple. "Quite a cold snap," exclaimed Alferov with a shake of his yellow beard. "Don't kiss it, the glove's dirty," said Miss Luzhin, and looking with a smile at Miss Alferov's enchanting, always animated face, she asked why she had never come to visit them. "And you're putting on weight, sir," growled Alferov, squinting playfully at Luzhin's stomach. Exaggerated by his wadded overcoat. Luzhin looked imploringly at his wife. "Remember, you're always welcome," she said, nodding. "Wait, Mashinka, do you know their telephone number?" asked Alferov. "You know." "Fine. Well, so long, as they say in Soviet Russia. My deepest respects to your mother." "There's something a little mean and a little pathetic about him," said Miss Luzhin, taking her husband's arm and changing step in order to match his. "But Mashinka, what a darling, what eyes! Don't walk so fast, dear Luzhin, it's slippery." The light snow ceased to fall. A spot of gray gleamed through palely, and the flat, bloodless disk of the sun floated out. "You know what? Let's go to the right today," suggested Miss Luzhin. "We've never been that way, I believe." "Look, oranges," said Luzhin with relish, and recalled how his father had asserted that when you pronounce limon, lemon, in Russian, you involuntarily pull a long face, but when you say appelsin, orange, you are give a broad smile. The salesgirl deftly spread the mouth of the paper bag and rammed the cold-pocketed red globes into it. Luzhin began to peel an orange as he walked, frowning in anticipation that the juice would squirt in his eye. He put the peel in his pocket because it would have stood out too vividly on the snow, and because perhaps you could make jam with it. "Is it good?" asked his wife. Luzhin smacked his lips on the last segment, and with a contented smile was about to take his wife's arm again, but suddenly he stopped and looked around. Having thought for a moment, he walked back to the corner and looked at the name of the street. Then he quickly caught up with his wife again and thrust out his cane in the direction of the nearest house, an ordinary gray stone house separated from the street by a small garden behind iron railings. "My dad used to reside here," said Luzhin. 35A, 35A, his wife repeated after him, not knowing what to say and looking up at the windows. Luzhin walked on, cutting snow away from the railings with his cane. Presently he stopped stock-still in front of a stationery store where the wax dummy of a man with 2 faces, one sad and the other joyful, was throwing open his jacket alternately to the left and right. The fountain pen clipped into the left pocket of his white waistcoat and sprinkled the whiteness with ink, while at the right the pen was never in. Luzhin took a great fancy to the bifacial man, and even thought of buying him. "Listen, Luzhin," said his wife when he had his fill of the window, I wanted to ask you for a long time. Haven't some things remained after your father's death? What are they all? Where are they all? Luzhin shrugged his shoulders. There was a man called Khrushchenko, he muttered after a while. I don't understand, said his wife questioningly. He wrote to me in Paris, explained Luzhin reluctantly, about the death and funeral and all that, and that he preserved the things left after the late father. Oh, Luzhin, she sighed. What you do to the language. She reflected a moment and added, It doesn't matter to me, but I just thought it might be pleasant for you to have those things, as having belonged to your father. Luzhin remained silent. She imagined those unwanted things, perhaps those pen that the old man Luzhin wrote his books with, some documents or other, photographs, and she grew sad and mentally reproached her husband for hard-heartedness. But one thing has to be done without fail, she said decisively. We must go to the cemetery to see his grave, to see that it's not neglected. Cold and far, said Luzhin. We'll do it in a day or two, she decided. The weather is bound to change. Careful, please, there's a car coming. The weather got worse, and Luzhin, remembering that depressing waste patch and the cemetery wind, begged for their trip to be postponed to the following week. The frost, incidentally, was extraordinary. They closed the ice rink, which was always unlucky. Last winter had been thaw after thaw, and a pool of place of ice, and now such a cold spell that not even schoolboys were up to skating. In the parks, little high-breasted birds lay on the snow with feet in the air. The helpless mercury, under the influence of its surroundings, fell even lower and lower, and even the polar bears in the zoo found that the management had overdone it. The Luzhin apartment turned out to be one of those fortunate flats with heroic central heating, which one did not have to sit around in fur coats and blankets. His wife's parents, driven insane by the cold, were remarkably willing guests of the central heating. Luzhin, wearing the old jacket that had been saved from destruction, sat at his desk assiduously drawing a white cube standing before him. His father-in-law walked about the study telling long, perfectly proper anecdotes, or else sat on the sofa with a newspaper, from time to time breathing deep and then clearing his throat. His mother-in-law and wife stayed in the tea-table, and from the study across the dark drawing-room one could see the bright yellow lampshade in the dining-room, his wife's illuminated pale profile on the brown background of a sideboard, and her bare arms, which with her elbows a long way in front of her on the table, she bent back to one shoulder, her fingers interlaced. Or suddenly she would smoothly stretch an arm out and touch some gleaming object on the tablecloth. Luzhin put the cube aside, took a clean sheet of paper, prepared a tin box with buttons of watercolor in it, and hastened to draw this vista. But while he was painstakingly tracing out the lines of perspective with the aid of a ruler, something changed at the far end. His wife disappeared from the vivid rectangle of the dining room, and the light went out and came on again closer in the drawing room, and no perspective existed any longer. In general, he rarely got the colors, and indeed preferred pencil. The dampness of the watercolors made the paper buckle unpleasantly, and the wet colors would run together. On occasion it would be impossible to get rid of some extraordinarily tenacious Prussian blue. No sooner would you get a small bit of it on the very tip of your brush than it would already be running all over the enamel inside of the box, devouring the shade you had prepared, and turning the water in the glass a poisonous blue. There were thick tubes with India ink and ceruse, but the caps invariably got lost, and the necks would dry up, and then he pressed too hard, the tube would burst at the bottom, and thence would come crawling and writhing a fat worm of goo. His daubings were fruitless, and even the simplest things, a vase with flowers or a sunset copied from a travel folder in the Riviera, came out spotty, sickly, horrible. The drawing was nice. He drew his mother-in-law, and she was offended. He drew his wife in profile, and she said that if she looked like that there were no reason to marry her. And on the other hand, his father-in-law's high-starched color came out very well. Luzhin took great pleasure in sharpening pencils and in measuring things before him, screwing up one eye and raising his pencil with his thumb pressed against it, and he would move his eraser over the paper with care, pressing his palm on the sheet, for he knew from experience that otherwise there would come a loud crack and the sheet would crease, and he would blow off the particles of rubber very delicately, fearing to smudge in drawing by touching it with his hand. Most of all, he liked that his wife had advised him to begin with, and was constantly returned to, white cubes, pyramids, cylinders, and a fragment of plaster ornament that reminded him of drawing lessons at school, the sole acceptable subject. He was soothed by the thin lines that he drew and redrew 100 times, achieving a maximum of sharpness, accuracy, and purity. And it was remarkably nice to shade tenderly and evenly, not pressing too hard, in regularly applied strokes. Finished, he said, holding the paper away from him and looking at the completed cube through his eyelashes. His father-in-law put on his pince-nez and looked at it for a long time, nodding his head. His mother-in-law and wife came from the drawing-room, and also looked. It even casts a tiny shadow, said his wife. A very handsome cube. Well done, you're a real cubist, said his mother-in-law. Luzhin, smiling on the one side of his mouth, took the drawing and looked round the walls of his study. By the door one of his productions was already hanging, a train on a bridge spanning an abyss. There was also something in the drawing room, a skull and a telephone directory. In the dining room were some extremely round oranges, which everyone for some reason took for tomatoes, and the bedroom was adorned by a bas-relief done in charcoal and a confidential conversation between a cone and a pyramid. He went out of the study, his eyes roving over the walls, and his wife said with a sigh, "I wonder where dear Luzhin will hang this one." "You haven't yet deigned to inform me," began her mother, pointing to her chin to a heap of gaudy travel folders lying on the desk. "But I don't know myself," said Miss Luzhin. "It's very difficult to decide. Everywhere is beautiful. I think we'll go to Nice first." "I would advise the Italian lakes," said her father, and folding up the newspaper and removing his pince-nez, began to relate how beautiful the lakes were. "I'm afraid he has grown rather tired of the talk of our journey," said Miss Luzhin. "One fine day we'll simply get in the train and go." "Not before April," said her mother imploringly. "You promised me, you know." Luzhin returned to the study. "I had a box and thumbtacks somewhere," he said, looking at the desk and slapping his pockets, whereupon again, for the third and fourth time, had a feeling there was something in his left pocket, but not the box. And there was not time to investigate. The tacks were found on the desk. Luzhin took them and hastily went out. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Just imagine, yesterday morning," she began to tell her daughter that she had been called by a woman who had unexpectedly arrived from Russia. The woman had often visited them as a young girl in St. Petersburg. It turned out that several years ago she had married a Soviet businessman or official. It had been impossible to understand exactly, and on her way to a spa when her husband was going to gather new strength, she had stopped off for a week or two in Berlin. "I feel a bit awkward, you know, about a Soviet citizen coming to our place, but she's so persistent. I'm amazed she's not afraid to telephone. Why, if they learn in Sovietsia that she rang me up, oh, Mama, she's probably a very unhappy woman. She's broken out temporarily to freedom, and she feels like seeing somebody." "Well, then, I'll pass her on to you," said her mother with relief, "especially as it's warmer at your place." And several days afterward, at midnight, the lady appeared. Luzhin was still slumbering, since he had slept badly the night before. Twice he woke up with choking cries, suffocated by a nightmare. And now Miss Luzhin somehow did not feel up to guess. The visitor turned out to be a slim, animated, nicely made-up, nicely bobbed lady who was dressed like Miss Luzhin, with expensive simplicity, loudly interrupting one another and assuring one another that neither had changed a bit, except perhaps to grow prettier. They went through to the study, which was cozier than the drawing room. The newcomer remarked to herself that Miss Luzhin 10 to 12 years ago had been a rather graceful, lively little girl, and now had grown plumper, paler, and quieter, while Miss Luzhin found that the modest, silent young lady who used to visit them and was in love with the student later shot by the Reds had turned into a very interesting, confident lady. "So this is your Berlin. Thank you kindly. I almost died with cold. At home in Leningrad, it's warmer, really warmer." "How is it, St. Petersburg? It must have changed a lot?" asked Miss Luzhin. "Of course it's changed," replied the newcomer jauntily. "And a terribly difficult life," said Miss Luzhin, nodding thoughtfully. "Oh, what nonsense. Nothing of the sort. They're working at home, building. Even my boy. What? You didn't know I had a little boy? Well, I have. I have a cute little squirt. Well, even he says that at home in Leningrad they work, like in Berlin. The bourgeois don't do anything. And in general he finds Berlin far worse than home, and doesn't even want to look at anything. He's so observant, you know, and sensitive. No, speaking seriously, the child's right. I myself feel how we've outstripped Europe. Take our theater. Why, you in Europe don't have a theater. It just doesn't exist. I'm not in the least, you understand, not in the least praising the communists, but you have to admit one thing. They look ahead. They build. Intensive construction. I don't understand politics, said Miss Luzhin slowly and plaintively, but it just seems to me. I'm only saying that one has to be broad-minded, continued the visitor hastily. Take this, for instance. As soon as I arrived, I bought an emigre paper. Of course, my husband said jokingly, you know, why do you waste money, my girl, on such filth? He expressed himself worse than that, but let's call it that for the sake of decency. But me? No, I said, you have to look at everything, find out everything absolutely impartially, and imagine I opened the paper and began to read, and there was such a slander painted there, such lies, and everything so crude. I rarely see the Russian newspaper, said Miss Luzhin. Mamma, for instance, gets a Russian newspaper from Serbia, I believe. It is a conspiracy, continued the lady, nothing but abuse, and nobody dares to utter a peep in our favor. Really, let's talk about something else, said Miss Luzhin distractedly. I can't express it. I'm very poor at speaking about these matters, but I feel you're mistaken. Now, if you want to talk about it with my parents some day. And saying this, Miss Luzhin imagined to herself, not without a certain pleasure, that her most of their bulging eyes and strident cries, well, you're still little. The lady indulgently smiled. Tell me what you're doing, and what does your husband do? What is he? He used to play chess, replied Miss Luzhin. He was a remarkable player, but then he overstrained himself, and now he is resting, and please, you mustn't talk to him about chess. Yes, I know he is a chess player, said the newcomer, but what is he? A reactionary? A white guardist? Really, I don't know, laughed Miss Luzhin. I heard a thing or two about him, continued the newcomer. When your mamma told me you had married Luzhin, I thought immediately that it was he. I had a good acquaintance in Leningrad, and she told me with such naive pride, how she had taught her little nephew to play chess and how he later became a remarkable—" At this point the conversation, a strange noise occurred in the next room, as if someone had knocked against something, and there let out a cry. "One moment," said Miss Luzhin, jumping up from the sofa, and was about to slide open the door to the drawing room, but changing her mind, she went out to the hall. In the drawing room she saw a completely unexpected Luzhin. He was in his dressing gown and bedroom slippers and holding a piece of white bread in one hand, but it was not this, of course, that was surprising. The surprising thing was the trembling excitement distorting his face, the wide-open gleaming eyes, and the forehead looking as if it had grown lumpy, or the vein as if it had swollen, and catching sight of his wife who appeared to pay no attention to her at first, but continued to stand looking with open mouth in the direction of the study. An instant later it turned out that his excitement was joyful. He clicked his teeth joyfully at his wife, then turned heavily in a circle, almost knocking the palm over, lost a slipper which slithered, like a live thing, into the dining room, where some cocoa was steaming, and speedily went after it. "Nothing, nothing," said Luzhin slyly, and like a man reveling in a secret find, he slapped himself on the knees, and closing his eyes began to shake his head. "That lady's from Russia," said his wife probingly. "She knows your aunt, who, well, just an aunt of yours." "Excellent, excellent," said Luzhin, and suddenly choked with laughter. "What am I frightened of?" she thought. "He's simply feeling jolly. He woke up in a good mood, and wanted, perhaps— It's some private joke, Luzhin?" "Yes, yes," said Luzhin, and added, finding a way out, "I wanted to introduce myself in my dressing gown." "So then we're feeling jolly, that's good," she said with a smile, "having something to eat and getting dressed. It seems to be a little warmer this morning." And leaving her husband in the dining room, Miss Luzhin quickly returned to the study. Her visitor was sitting on the couch and looking at some views of Switzerland on the pages of a travel leaflet. "Listen," she said, catching sight of Miss Luzhin. "I'm going to take advantage of you. I need to buy a few things, and I have absolutely no idea where the best stores are here. Yesterday I stood a solid hour in front of a store window, standing and thinking that perhaps there are stores that are even better, and then my German isn't up to much." Luzhin remained sitting in the dining room and continued from time to time to slap himself on the knees, and there was really something to celebrate. The combination he had been struggling to discern since the ball had suddenly revealed itself to him thanks to a chance phrase that had come flying out of the next room. During these few minutes he had still only had time to feel the keen delight of being a chess player, and pride and relief, and the physiological sensation of harmony which is so well known to artists. He still made many more small motions before he realized the true nature of his unusual discovery, finished his cocoa, shaved, transferred his studs to a clean shirt, and suddenly the delight vanished, and he was overwhelmed by other sensations. Just as some combination known from chess problems can be indistinctly repeated on the board in actual play, so now the consecutive repetition of a familiar pattern that was becoming noticeable in his present life. And as soon as this initial delight in having established the actual fact that repetition had passed, as soon as he began to carefully over his discovery, Luzhin shuddered. With vague admiration and vague horror, he observed how awesomely, how elegantly, how flexibly, move by move, the images of his childhood had been repeated: country house, town, school, aunt. But he still did not quite understand why this combination repetition inspired his soul such dread. He felt one thing keenly, a certain vexation that he had gone so long without noticing the cunning sequence of moves, and now recalling some trifle, and there had been so many of them, and at times so skilfully presented, that the repetition was almost concealed. Luzhin was indignant with himself for not having reflected, for not taking the initiative, but with trustful blindness, letting the combination unfold. But now he resolved to be more circumspect, to keep an eye on the further development of these moves, if there was to be one, and of course, to maintain his discovery an impenetrable secret, to be merry, extraordinarily merry. But from that day on there was no rest for him. He had, if possible, to contrive a defense against this perfidious combination, to free himself of it, and for this he had to foresee its ultimate aim, its dire direction, but this did not yet appear feasible, and the thought that the repetition would probably continue was so frightening that he was tempted to stop the clock of life, to suspend the game for good, to freeze, and at the same time he noticed that he continued to exist, that some kind of preparation was going on, a creeping development, and that he had no power to halt this movement. Perhaps his wife would have noticed the change in Luzhin sooner, his wooden jollity between intervals of sullenness, had she been with him more these days, but it so happened that it was precisely during these days that she was taken advantage of, as he had been promised, by the importunate lady from Russia, who forced her to spend hours taking her from store to store, and unhurriedly tried on hats, dresses, shoes, and then paid the Luzhins prolonged visits. She continued to maintain as before that there was no theatre in Europe, and to pronounce Leningrad instead of Petersburg with cold glibness, and for some reason Miss Luzhin took pity on her, accompanied her to cafes, and brought her son A fat, gloomy little boy deprived of the gift of speech in the presence of strangers, toys which he accepted fearfully and unwillingly, whereupon his mother affirmed that there was nothing here that he liked, and he yearned to return to his little co-pioneers. She also met Miss Luzhin's parents, but unfortunately the conversation about politics did not take place. They reminisced about former acquaintances, while Luzhin silently and concentratedly fed chocolates to little Ivan, and Ivan silently, concentratedly ate them, and then turned deep red and was hastily led out of the room. Meanwhile, the weather got warmer, and once or twice Miss Luzhin said to her husband that once this unfortunate woman with her unfortunate child and unpresentable husband had finally left, they should go the very first day without putting it off to visit the cemetery, and Luzhin nodded with a assiduous smile. The typewriter, geography, and drawing were abandoned, for he knew now that all this was part of the combination. It was an intricate repetition of all the moves that had been taken down since childhood. Ridiculous days. Miss Luzhin felt that she was not paying enough attention to her husband's moods. Something was slipping out of control, and yet she continued to listen politely to the newcomer's chatter and to translate her demands to shop assistants, and it was particularly unpleasant when a pair of shoes had already been worn once turned out to be unsuitable, and she had to accompany her to the store while the purple-faced lady bawled out of the firm in Russian and demanded that the shoes be changed, and then she had to be soothed and her caustic expressions be considerably toned down in the German version. On the evening before her departure, she came together with little Ivan to say goodbye. She left Ivan in the study while she went to the bedroom with Miss Luzhin, who for the 100th time showed her her wardrobe. Ivan sat on the couch and scratched his knee, trying not to look at Luzhin, who also did not know where to look and was thinking how to occupy the flabby child. "Telephone!" exclaimed Luzhin, finally in a high voice, and pointing to it with his finger, he began to laugh with deliberate astonishment, but Ivan, after looking sullenly in the direction of Luzhin's finger, averted his eyes, his lower lip hanging. "Train and precise," tried Luzhin again, and stretched out to his other hand, pointing to his own picture on the wall. Ivan's left nostril filled with a glistening droplet, and he sniffed, looking apathetically before him. "The author of a certain divine comedy," bellowed Luzhin, raising a hand to the bust of Dante. "Silence!" A slight sniffling. Luzhin was tired by his gymnastic movements and also grew still. He began to wonder whether there were any candy in the dining room or whether to play the photograph in the drawing room. But the little boy on the couch hypnotized him with his mere presence, and it was impossible to leave the room. A toy would do it, he said to himself, and then looked at his desk, measured the paper knife against the little boy's curiosity, found that the curiosity would not be roused by it, and began in despair to burrow in his pockets. And here again, as many times before, he felt that his left pocket, although empty, mysteriously retained some intangible contents. Luzhin thought that such a phenomenon was capable of interesting little Ivan. He sat down on the edge of the couch beside him and winked slyly. "Conjuring trick," he said, and started by showing that the pocket was empty. "This hole has no connection with the trick," he explained. Listlessly and malevolently, Ivan watched his movements. "But nevertheless, there is something here," said Luzhin rapturously, and winked. "In the lining," snorted Ivan, and with a shrug of his shoulders turned away. "Right," cried Luzhin, miming delight, and thrust one hand through the hole, holding on to the bottom of the jacket with his other one. At first some kind of red corner came into view, and then the whole object, something in the shape of a flat leather notebook. Luzhin looked at it with raised brows, turned it around in his hands, pulled a little flap out of its slit, and cautiously opened the thing. It was not a notebook, but a small folding chessboard of Morocco leather. Luzhin immediately recalled that it had been given to him by a club in Paris. All the participants in that tournament were given the knick-knack, some firm's advertisement, not simply a souvenir from the club. Lateral compartments on both leaves of the pocket board contained little celluloid pieces resembling fingernails, and each one bore the picture of a chess figure. These were placed into position on the board by inserting the pointed end in a tiny crack at the lower edge of each square, so that the rounded top of the piece with the drawn figure on it lay flat on the square. The effect was very elegant and neat. One could not help admiring the little red and white board, the smooth celluloid fingernails, and also the stamped gold letters along the horizontal edge of the board and the golden numbers along the vertical one. Opening his mouth wide with pleasure, Luzhin began to slip in the pieces. At first just a row of pawns along the second rank, but then he changed his mind, and with the tips of his fingers taking the tiny insertable figures out of their compartments, he set out the position of this game with Tarati at the point where it had been interrupted. This setting out was accomplished almost instantaneously, and immediately the whole material side of the matter dropped away. The tiny board lying open in the palm of his hand became intangible and weightless. The Morocco dissolved into pink and cream haze, and everything disappeared save the chess position itself, complex, pungent, charged with extraordinary possibilities. Luzhin, one finger pressed to his temple, was so immersed in thought that he did not notice that Ivan, for lack of something to do, had clambered down from the couch and had started to rock the black upright of the standard lamp. It heeled over and the light went out. Luzhin came out to his senses in complete darkness, and for the first moment did not realize where he was, or what was going on around him. An invisible creature was fidgeting and grunting close by, and suddenly the orange shade lit up again with transparent light, and a pale little boy with a shaven head was kneeling and straightening out the cord. Luzhin stared and banged the board shut. His terrible little devil, little Luzhin, for whom the chess pieces had been set out, crawled over the carpet on his knees. All this had happened once before, and again he had been caught and had not understood how exactly the repetition of a familiar theme could come out in practice. The following instant everything regained its balance. Ivan, snuffling, clambered back onto the couch. In the slight gloom beyond the orange light floated Luzhin's study, swaying gently. The red morocco notebook lay innocently on the carpet, and Luzhin knew that this was all a trick. The combination had still not completely developed, and soon a new dire repetition would manifest itself. Bending down quickly, he picked up and thrust into his pocket the material symbol of what had so voluptuously and so horribly pressed his imagination again. And he wondered where would be a surer place to hide it, but just then voices were heard. His wife came in with their visitor, and both swam toward him as if in cigarette smoke. "Ivan, get up, it's time to go." "Yes, yes, my dear, I still have so much to pack," and the lady then came up to Luzhin and began to take leave of him. "Very pleased to have made your acquaintance," she said, and between words managed to think what she had more than once thought before. "What a dunderhead, what a queer fish. Very pleased. Now I can tell your aunt that I've seen her little chess player, big now and famous. You must not fail to come and see us on your way back," interrupted Miss Luzhin hastily and loudly, for the first time looking with hatred at the woman's smiling wax-red lips and mercilessly stupid eyes. "But of course it goes without saying. Ivan, get up and say good-bye." Ivan carried this out with some reluctance, and they went into the entrance hall. "There's always a lot of fuss with letting people out here in Berlin," she said ironically, watching Miss Luzhin take the keys from her pier table. "Now we have an elevator," replied Miss Luzhin irrelevantly, yearning with fierce impatience for the lady's departure, and she signed to Luzhin with her eyebrow to offer the sealskin coat. Luzhin instead took down the child's overcoat from the hall stand, but fortunately the maid turned up at this moment. "Goodbye, goodbye," said Miss Luzhin, standing in the doorway, while the departing visitors, accompanied by the maid, arranged themselves in the elevator. From behind his wife's shoulder, Luzhin saw Ivan clamber onto the little bench, and then the doors closed, and the elevator sank down in its iron cage. Miss Luzhin ran to the study and fell face down on the couch. He sat beside her and began deep down inside him, with difficulty, to produce, glue together and sew up, a smile, preparing it for the moment when his wife turned to him. His wife turned. The smile came out completely, successfully. "Oof!" sighed Miss Luzhin. "We're finally rid of them," and quickly embracing her husband, she began to kiss him on the right eye, then the chin, then the left ear, observing a strict sequence that had been approved by him. "Well, cheer up," she repeated. "That madame's gone away now, disappeared." "Disappeared," said Luzhin obediently, with a sigh, kissed the hand that was patting his neck. "What tenderness," whispered his wife. "Ah, what sweet tenderness." It was time to go to bed. She went to undress, and Luzhin walked through all 3 rooms, looking for a place to hide the pocket chess set. Everywhere was insecure. The most unexpected places were invaded in the mornings by the snout of that rapacious vacuum cleaner. It is difficult to hide a thing. The other things are jealous and inhospitable, holding on firmly to their places and not allowing a homeless object escaping pursuit into a single cranny. Thus he did not manage to hide the morocco notebook that night, and subsequently he decided not to hide it at all, but simply to get rid of it. But this also proved to be far from easy, so it remained in his lining, and only after several months, when all danger was long, long past, only then was the pocket chess set found again, and by then its origin was obscure. 14. To herself, Miss Luzhin admitted that the 3-week visit of the lady whom Russia had not passed without leaving a trace. The visitor's opinions were false and stupid, but how prove it? She was horrified that in recent years she had taken so little interest in the science of exile, passively accepting the glossy, varnished, and cold-lettered views of her parents and paying no attention to the speeches she heard at emigre political meetings, which had once been the thing to attend. It occurred to her that Luzhin, too, perhaps, would have no taste for political matters, would perhaps revel in them the way millions of other intelligent people do, and a new occupation for Luzhin was essential. He had become strange. The familiar sullenness had reappeared. He had become strange. The familiar sullenness had reappeared, and there often was in his eyes a kind of slippery expression, as if he were hiding something from her. She was worried that he had still not found a completely engrossing hobby, and she reproached herself for the narrowness of her mental vision, and her inability to find the sphere, the idea, the object which would provide work and food for Luzhin's inactive talents. She knew she had to hurry, and that every unoccupied minute of Luzhin's life was a loophole for phantoms. Before departing for picturesque lands, it was necessary to find for Luzhin an interesting game, and only afterwards to resort to the balsam of travel, that decisive factor used by romantic millionaires to cure their spleen. She began with newspapers. She took out the subscriptions to Shnamaya, the Banner, Rosinin, the Russian, Roshianin, the Russian, Zarubishny Golos, the Voice of Exile, Obyednyny, Union, and Click, the Clarion, bought by the last numbers of Emigre magazines, and for comparison several Soviet magazines and newspapers. It was decided that every day after dinner they would read to one another aloud. Noticing that some newspapers printed a chess section, she wondered at first whether to cut out and destroy these bits, but she feared by this to insult Luzhin. Once or twice as examples of interesting play, old games of Luzhin would turn up. This was disagreeable and dangerous. She was unable to hide the issues with chess sections in them because Luzhin collected the newspapers with the aim of later binding them in form of large books. Whenever he opened a newspaper which proved to contain a smudgy chess diagram, she watched the expression on his face, but he felt her glance and merely skipped over it. And she did not know with what sinful impatience he waited those Thursdays or Mondays when the chess section appeared, and did not know with what curiosity he looked through the printed games in her absence. In the case of chess problems, he would glance sideways at the diagram, and with this glance, grasping the disposition of the pieces, would memorize the problem instantly and then solve it in his mind, while his wife read the editorial aloud to him. The whole activity comes down to the fundamental transformation of augmentation, which are designed to ensure, read his wife in an even voice, and interesting in construction, thought Luzhin. Black's queen is completely free. Draws a clear distinction between their vital interests. Moreover, it would not be superfluous to note that the Achilles' heels of this punitive hand, Black has an obvious defense against the threat on H7, thought Luzhin, and smiled mechanically when his wife, interrupting a reading for a moment, had suddenly said in a voice, "I don't understand what he means." "If in this respect," she continued, "nothing is respected—" "Oh, splendid!" exclaimed Luzhin, mentally finding the key to the problem. "A bewitchingly elegant sacrifice, and disaster is not far away." His wife concluded the article, and having finished, sighed. The thing that was the more closely she read the newspapers, the more bored she grew, and a fog of words and metaphors, suppositions and arguments was used to obscure the clear truth, which she always felt but was never able to express. But when she turned to the newspapers of the other world, Soviet newspapers, her boredom knew no bounds. From then came the chill of sepulchral counting house, the boredom of fly-blown offices, and they reminded her somehow of the lifeless features of a certain little official in one of those establishments she had had to visit in the days when she and Luzhin were being sent from department to department for the sake of some paltry document. The little official was seedy and touchy, and was eating a diabetic roll. He probably received a miserable salary, was married, and had a child whose body was covered with rash. The document that they did not have and had to get, he endowed with cosmic significance. The whole world hung on that piece of paper, and would crumble hopelessly to dust if a person were deprived of it. And that was not all. It turned out the Luzhins could not obtain it until monstrous time spans. Millennia of despair and emptiness had elapsed, and the only means allowed one of easing this Weltschmerz was the writing of petitions. The official snapped at poor Luzhin for smoking in his office, and Luzhin started and stuffed the butt into his pocket. Through the window could be seen a house under construction, all in scaffolding in a slanting rain. In the corner of the room hung a black little jacket with the official changed during the working hours for a lustrine one, and the desk gave a general impression of violet ink with the same transcendental hopelessness. They went away with empty hands, and she felt as if she had to do battle with a grey and blind eternity, which in fact conquered her, disdainfully brushing aside her timid earthly bribe, 3 cigars. In another establishment they received a piece of paper instantly. Later Miss Luzhin thought with horror that a little official had sent them away, probably imagining them wandering like inconsolable spectres through a vacuum, and perhaps was waiting for a submissive, sobbing return. It was unclear to her why precisely this image floated before her as soon as she picked up a Moscow newspaper. The same sense of boredom and pity perhaps, but this was not enough for her. Her mind was not satisfied, and suddenly she realized that she was also looking for a formula, the official embodiment of feeling, but this was not the point at all. Her mind was unable to grasp the complicated struggle among the hazy opinions expressed by the various immigrant newspapers. The diversity of opinion particularly stunned her, used as she was to suppose apathetically that everyone who did not think like her parents thought like a musing lame fellow who had spoken of sociology to a crowd of giggly girls. There turned out to be the most subtle shades of opinion and the most fibrous hostility, and if all this was too complex for the mind, then the heart began to gossip one thing quite distinctly. Both here and in Rust people tortured and desired to torture other people, but there were torture and desire to torture were 100 times greater than here, and therefore here was better. But Luzhin's turn came to read aloud. She would choose from him a humorous article or else a brief, heartfelt story. He read with a funny stammer, pronouncing some of the words oddly and at times going past a period, or else not reaching it, and raising or lowering his tone of voice for a low logical reason. It was not difficult for her to realize that the newspapers did not interest him. Whenever she engaged him in a conversation concerning an article they had just read, he hastily agreed with all her conclusions, and when, in order to check on him, she said deliberately that all the emigre papers were lying, and he also agreed newspapers were one thing, people another. It would be nice to listen to these people. She imagined how people of various tendencies, a bunch of intellectuals, as her mother put it, would gather in their apartment, and how Luzhin, listening to these live disputes and conversations on new themes, would not blossom out to then at least find a temporary diversion. If all her mother's acquaintances, the most enlightened and varied leftists, as her mother affirmed with a certain coquetry, was considered to be Oleg Sergeyevich Smorovsky, but when Miss Luzhin asked him to bring her some place very interesting, free-thinking people, who read not only Zhemaya, but also Obyedny and Zhurebsky Golos, Smorovsky replied that she should understand, did not revolve in such circles, and then began to censor such revolving, and quickly explained that he revolved in other circles, which revolving was essential, and Miss Luzhin's head began to spin as it used to in amusement parks on a revolving disc. After this failure, she began to extract from various tiny chambers of her memory people who she had chanced to meet and who might be of aid to her now. She recalled a Russian girl who used to sit next to her at the Berlin School of Applied Arts, the daughter of a political worker of the Democratic group. She called Everov, who had been everywhere and liked to relate to an old poet who had once died in his arms. She recalled an unappreciated relative working in the office of a liberal Russian newspaper, the name of which was gutturally related every evening by the fat paper woman at the current corner. She chose one or two other people. It also occurred to her that many intellectuals probably remembered Luzhin, the writer, or knew of Luzhin, the chess player, and would visit her home with pleasure. And what did Luzhin care about all this? The only thing that really interested him was the complex, cunning game in which he somehow had become enmeshed. Helplessly and sullenly, he thought for signs of chess repetition, still wondering towards what it was tending, but to always on his guard. To strain his attention constantly was also impossible. Something would temporarily weaken inside him. He would take carefree pleasure in a game printed in the newspaper, presently would note with despair that he had been turned away, that the delicate move had just been made, and his life mercilessly continuing the fatal combination. They would decide to redouble his watchfulness and keep track of every second of his life, for the traps could be everywhere, and he was oppressed most of all by the impossibility of inventing a rational defense, for his opponent's aim was still hidden. Too stout and flabby for his ears, he walked this way and that among people he thought up by his wife, tried to find a quiet spot, and the whole time looked and listened for a hint as to the next move, for a continuation of the game that had been started by him but had not directed with awful force against him. It happened that such a hint would occur, something would move forward, but it did not make a general meaning of combination clearer. And a quiet spot was difficult to find. People addressed questions to him that he had to repeat several times to himself before answering, understanding their simple meaning and finding a simple answer. In all three untelescoped room was a very bright, not one very spared by the lamps. People were sitting in the dining room and on comfortable chairs in the drawing room, and on the divan in the study, one wearing pale flannel pants strove repeatedly to settle himself on the desk, moving aside the interests of comfort, the box of paints, and a pile of unsealed newspapers. An elderly doctor, with a face manipulated by many roles, a mellow-voiced person, who surely give his best performances in carpet slippers, and parts demanding grunts, groans, crimsful hangovers, and quirky, fruity expression, was sitting on the divan next to the corpulent, black-eyed wife of the journalist Bars, an ex-actress, reminiscing with her about the time they had once played together in Bullet Town in the melodrama A Dream of Love. "Do you remember that mix-up with the top hat and the neat way I got out of it?" said the actor mellowly. "Endless ovations," said the black-eyed lady. "That gave me such ovations as I shall never forget." In this way they interrupted one another, each with his or her own recollections, and the man in the pale pants for the first time asked amusing Luzhin for one small cigarette. He was beginning poet and read his poems with fervor, with a sing-song lilt, slightly jerking his head and looking into space. Normally he held his head high, as a result of his large mobile Adam's apple, which was very noticeable. He never got that cigarette since Luzhin moved absent-mindedly into the drawing-room, and the poet, looking for with reverence at his fat nape, thought what a wonderful chess player he was, and looked forward to the time when he would be able to talk with breast covered recovered Luzhin about chess, of which he was a great enthusiast, and then catching sight of Luzhin's wife through the gap in the door, he debated with himself for a while whether it was worth trying to dangle after her. Miss Luzhin was listening smilingly to what was being said by the tall, pockmarked journalist Bars, and was thinking how difficult it would be to seat those guests around one tea table, and would it not be better in future simply to serve them where they sat. Bars spoke very fast, and always as if he were obliged to express a tortuous idea with all its writers and simply appendages in the shortest possible period of time to prop up and readjust all this, and if his listener happened to be attentive, then little by little he began to realize that this maze of rapid words was gradually revealing an astonishing harmony, and that the speech itself, with the occasional incorrect stresses and journalese, was suddenly transformed as if acquiring its grace and nobility from the idea expressed. Miss Luzhin, catching sight of her husband, thrust a plate into his hands with a piece beautifully peeled orange on it, and went past him into the study. "And note," said a plain-looking man who had listened to the whole of the journalist's idea and appreciated it, "note that Tyutchev's night school is cool, and the stars in it are round and moist and glossy, and not simply bright dots." He did not say any more, since in general he spoke little, not so much of modesty, it seemed, as out of fear of spilling something precious that was not his but had been entrusted to him. Miss Luzhin incidentally liked him very much, and precisely became one of his plainness, the neutrality of his features, as if he were himself only the outside of a vessel with something so sacred and rare that it would be a sacrilege to paint the clay. His name was Petrov. Not a single thing about him was remarkable. He had written nothing. He lived like a beggar, but never talked about it to anyone. His sole function in life was to carry, reverently with concentration, that which he had been entrusted to him, something which it was necessary at all costs to preserve in all its detail and all its purity, and for that reason he even walked with small careful steps, trying not to bump into anyone, and only very seldom, only when it was discerned a kind of solicitude in the person he was talking to, did he reveal for a moment from the whole of that enormous something that he carried mysteriously within him, some tender, priceless little trifle, a line from Pushkin, or a peasant name of a wild flower. "I remember our host's father," said the journalist when Luzhin's back retreated into the dining-room. "He doesn't look like it, but there's something analogous in the set of the shoulders. He was a good soul, a nice fellow, but as a writer, what? Do you really find those oleographic tales for youngsters? Please, to the dining-room," said Miss Luzhin, returning from the study to 3 guests she had found there. "Tea is served. Come, I beg you." Those already at the table were sitting at one end, while on the other solitary Luzhin, his head bent gloomily, sat chewing a segment of orange and stirring the tea in his glass. Alfirov was there with his wife. Then there was a swarthy, brightly made-up girl who drew marvelous firebirds, and a bald young man who jokingly called himself a worker for the press, but secretly yearned to be a political ringleader, and 2 women, the wives of lawyers, and also sitting at the table was delightful Vasily Vasilievich, shy, stately, pure-hearted, with a fair beard, and wearing an old man's prunella shoes. Under the Tsar he had been exiled to Siberia, and then abroad, whence he had returned in 1917 and succeeded in catching a brief glimpse of the revolution before being exiled again, this time by the Bolsheviks. He talked earnestly about his work in the underground, about Kautsky in Geneva, and was able to look at Miss Luzhin without any emotion, for in her he found a resemblance to the clear-eyed, ideal maidens who had worked with him for the good of the people. As usually happened at the gatherings, when all the guests had been rounded up and placed at a table together, silence ensued. The silence was such that the maid's breathing was clearly audible as she served the tea. Miss Luzhin several times caught herself with the impossible thought that it would be a good idea to ask the maid why she breathed so loudly. Could she not do it more quietly? She was not very efficient in general, this pudgy wench. Telephone calls were particularly disastrous. As she listened to the breathing, Miss Luzhin recalled briefly how the maid had laughingly informed her for a few days beforehand, "Mr. Felty. Here, I wrote down the number." Miss Luzhin called the number, but a sharp voice replied that it was a movie company's office and that no Mr. Felty was there. Some kind of hopeless muddle. She was about to start criticizing German maids in order to break her neighbor's silence, when she noticed that a conversation had already flared up, and they were talking about a new novel. Bars was asserting that it was elaborately and subtly written, and that every word betrayed a sleepless night. A woman's voice said, "Oh no, it reads so easily." Petrov leaned over to Miss Luzhin and whispered a quotation from Zhukovsky. "That which took pains to write is read with ease." And poet, interrupting someone in mid-word and rolling his R's vehemently, shouted that Zhukovsky was a brainless parrot, in which Vasily Vasilievich, who had not read the novel, shook his head reproachfully. Only when they were already in the front hall and everyone was taking leave of the others at a kind of dress rehearsal, for they all took leave of one another again in the street, though they all had to go to the same direction, only then did the actor with the manipulated face suddenly clap his hand to his forehead. "I almost forgot, darling," he said to Miss Luzhin, squeezing her hand at each word. "The other day a man from the movie kingdom asked me for your telephone number," whereupon he made a surprised face and released Miss Luzhin's hand. "Well, you don't know that I'm in the movies now?" "Oh, yes, big parts with close-ups." At this point he was shouldered aside by the poet, and thus Miss Luzhin did not find out what person the actor had meant. The guests departed. Luzhin was sitting sideways at the table, which frozen in various poses like the characters in the concluding scene of Gogol's The Inspector General, where the remains of the refreshments empty in unfinished glasses. One of the hands lay spread heavily on the tablecloth. From beneath half-lowered, one more puffy lids, he looked up at the black match-tip, writhing in pain after having just gone out of his fingers. His large face with loose folds around the nose and mouth was slightly shiny, and on his cheeks the constantly shaved, constantly sprouting bristle showed golden in the lamplight. His darkly grey suit, shaggy to the touch, enfolded him tighter than before, although it had been planned with plenty of room. Thus Luzhin sat, not stirring. The glass dishes with bonbons in them gleamed. The teaspoon lay on the tablecloth, far from any glass or plate, and for some reason a small cream puff that did not look especially enticing but was very good had remained untouched. "What's the matter?" thought Miss Luzhin, looking at her husband. Goodness, what's the matter? And she had an aching feeling of impotence and hopelessness, as if she had taken on a job that was too difficult for her. Everything was useless. There was no point in trying and thinking up amusements and inviting interesting guests. She tried to imagine how she would take this Luzhin, blind and sullen once more, around the Riviera. All she could imagine was Luzhin sitting in this room and staring at the floor. With a nasty sense of looking through the keyhole of destiny, she bent forward to see her future 10, 20, 30 years, and it was all the same, with no change, the same sullen, bowed Luzhin in silence and hopelessness. Wicked, unworthy thoughts. Her soul immediately strained up again, and around her were familiar images and cares. It was time to go to bed. Better not buy that shortcake next time. How nice Petrov was. Tomorrow morning they would have to see about their passports. The trip to the cemetery was being postponed again. Nothing could have been simpler, but it seemed than to take a taxi and drive out to the suburbs, to this tiny Russian cemetery and its patch of wasteland. But it always happened that they were unable to go. Either Luzhin's teeth ached, or there was a passport business, or else something else. Pretty, petty, imperceptible obstacles, and how many different worries there would be now. Luzhin definitely had to be taken to the dentist. "Is it aching again?" she asked, putting her hand on Luzhin's. "Yes, yes," he said, and distorting his face, sucked one cheek with a popping sound. He had invented the toothache the other day in order to explain his low spirits and silence. "Tomorrow I'll ring up the dentist," she said decisively. "It's not necessary," muttered Luzhin. "Please, it's not necessary." His lips trembled. He felt as if he were about to burst into tears. Everything had become so terrifying now. "What's not necessary?" she asked tenderly, and expressed the question mark with a little sound pronounced with closed lips. He shook his head, and just in case sucked his tooth again. "Not necessary to go to the dentist? No, Luzhin is certainly going to be taken to the dentist. One should not neglect this." Luzhin rose from his chair, and holding his cheek went into the bedroom. "I'll give him a pill," she said. "That's what I'll do." The pill did not work. Luzhin stayed awake for long after his wife fell asleep. To tell the truth, the hours of the night, the hours of insomnia in the secure, closed bedroom, were the only ones he could think peacefully without the fear of missing a new movie in the monstrous combination. At night, particularly if he lay without moving, and with his eyes closed, nothing could happen. Carefully and coolly as he could, Luzhin would go over all the moves already made against him, but as soon as he began to guess at what forms coming repetition of the scheme of his past would take, he grew confused and frightened by the inevitable and unthinkable catastrophe bearing down on him with merciless precision. On this night, more than ever, he felt helplessness in the face of this slow, elegant attack, and he tried not to sleep at all, to prolong as much as possible this night, this quiet darkness, to arrest time at midnight. His wife slept absolutely soundlessly. Most likely she was not there at all. Only the ticking of the little clock on the bedside table proved that time continued to exist. Luzhin listened to these tiny heartbeats and became lost in thought again, and then he started noticing that the ticking of the clock had stopped. It seemed to him that the night had stopped forever, and there was not a single sound now that would indicate its passing. Time was dead. Everything was all right. A velvet hush. Sleep imperceptibly took advantage of this happiness and relief, but now in sleep there was no rest at all, for sleep consisted of 64 squares, a gigantic board in the middle of which, trembling, a stark naked, Luzhin stood, the size of a pond, and peered at the dim positions of huge pieces, megacephalous, with crowns or manes. Then he woke up with his wife already dressed, bent over him, and kissed him on the glabella. "Good morning, dear Luzhin," she said. "It's 10 o'clock already. What shall we do today? The dentist or your visas?" Luzhin looked over with the bright, distracted eyes, and immediately closed his lids again. "And who forgot to wind up the clock of the night?" laughed his wife, fondly worrying the plump white flesh of his neck. "The way you could sleep your whole life away." She bent her head to one side, looking at her husband's profile, surrounded by the bulges in the pillow, and nothing had fallen asleep again, smiled and left the room. She and Stadi went before the window and looked at the greenish-blue sky, wintry and cloudless, thinking it would probably be cold today, and Luzhin should wear his cardigan. The telephone rang on the desk, and evidently her mother wanting to know if they would be dining at her place. "Hello," said Miss Luzhin, perching on the edge of the chair. "Hello, hello," shouted an unfamiliar voice into the telephone, excitedly and crossly. "Yes, yes, I'm here," said Miss Luzhin, and moved to an armchair. "Who's there?" asked a displeased voice in German, with a Russian accent. "And who's speaking?" inquired Miss Luzhin. "Is Mr. Luzhin at home?" asked the voice in Russian. "Kto говорит? Who is speaking?" repeated Miss Luzhin with a smile. Silence. The voice seemed to be debating with itself with the question whether to come out into the open or not. "I want to talk to Mr. Luzhin," he began again, reverting to German. "A very urgent and very important matter." "One moment," said Miss Luzhin, and walked up and down the room a time or two. No, it was not worth waking Luzhin. She returned to the telephone. "He's still sleeping," she said, "but if you want to leave a message—" "Oh, this is very annoying," said the voice, adopting Russian finally. "This is the second time I've called. I left my telephone number last time. The matter is extremely important to him and permits no delay." "I am his wife," said Miss Luzhin. "If you need anything—" "Very glad to make your acquaintance," interrupted the voice briskly. "My name is Valentina. Your husband, of course, has told me about me. So this is what. Tell him as soon as he wakes up to get straight into a taxi and come over to me. Kinokonzern Veritas, Rapidastrasse, 1882. It's a very urgent matter and very important to him," continued the voice, switching to German again, "either because of the importance of the matter or simply because the German address had been drawn to him in the corresponding language." Mr. Luzhin pretended to be writing down the address, and then said, "Perhaps you will still tell me first what the matter is about." The voice grew unpleasantly agitated. "I'm an old friend of your husband. Every second is precious. I'll expect him today at exactly 12 o'clock. Please tell him. Every second." "All right," said Miss Luzhin. "I'll tell him. Only I don't know. Perhaps today will be inconvenient for him. Just whisper in his ear, 'Valentinov is expecting you,'" said the voice with a laugh, sang out a German goodbye, and vanished behind the click of a trapdoor. For several moments Miss Luzhin sat there thinking, and then called herself a fool. She should have explained it first of all, that Luzhin no longer played chess. Valentinov only now did she remember the visiting card she found in the opera hat. Valentinov, of course, was acquainted with Luzhin through chess. Luzhin had no other acquaintances. He had never mentioned a single old friend. This man's tone was completely impossible. She should have demanded that he explain his business. She was a fool. "And what could be done now?" asked Luzhin. "No." "Who was Valentinov? An old friend." Grasky said he had been asked. Aha, very simple. She went into the bedroom, assured herself that Luzhin would still be sleeping. He usually slept amazingly soundly in the mornings, and went back to the telephone. Luckily, the actor turned out to be at home, and immediately launched into a long account of the frivolous and mean actions committed at one time or other by the lady he had been talking to at the party. Miss Luzhin heard him without impatiently, and then asked who Valentinov was. The actor said, "Oh, yes," and continued, "You see how forgetful I am. Life is impossible without a prompter," and finally, after giving a detailed account of his relations with Valentinov, he mentioned, in passing chat, according to him, he, Valentinov, had been Luzhin's chess father, so to speak, had made a great player out of him. Then the actor returned to the actress of the night before, and her mentioning of the last meanness of hers began to take voluble leave of Miss Luzhin, his last words being, "I kiss the palm of your little hand. So that's how it is," said Miss Luzhin, hanging up the receiver. "All right." At this point she recollected that she had mentioned Valentinov's name once or twice in the conversation that her husband might have been chanced to hear if it had come out of the bedroom to the hall. Her heart missed a beat, and she ran to check if he was still sleeping. He had wakened and was smoking in bed. "We won't go anywhere this morning," she said. "Anyway, it's too late. We'll dine at Mamma's. Stay in bed. We'll dine longer. It's good for you. You're fat." Closing the bedroom door firmly and the door of the study, she hastily looked up the Veritas number of the phone book, listened to see if Luzhin was near, and then rang up. It turned out not to be so easy to get hold of Valentinov. 3 different people came to the telephone in turn, replied they would get to him immediately, and then the operator cut her off as she had to start all over again. At the time, she was trying to speak as low as possible, and it was necessary to repeat things, which was very unpleasant. Finally, a yellowy, worn little voice informed her dejectedly that Valentinov was not there, but would definitely be back at 12:30. She asked whether he be informed that Luzhin was not able to come since he was ill, would continue to be ill for a long time, and begged earnestly not to be bothered any more. Replacing the receiver on a hook, she listened again, and hearing only the beating of her own heart, she then sighed and said, "Ooh," with a boundless relief. Valentinov had been dealt with. Thank goodness she had been alone at the telephone. Now it was over, and soon they would depart. She still had to call her mother and the dentist, but Valentinov had to be dealt with. What a cloying name, and for a minute she became thoughtful, accomplishing during that 1 minute, and sometimes happens, a long leisurely journey. She set off in Luzhin's past, dragging Valentinov with her, visualizing him from his voice, the horn-rimmed spectacles, and long-legged. As she journeyed through the mist, she looked for a spot where she could dump his slippery, repulsively wriggling Valentinov. She found she could not, because she knew almost nothing about Luzhin's youth. Fighting her way still further back into the depths, she passed through this spectral spa with its semi-spectral hotel, where the 14-year-old prodigy had lived, and found herself in Luzhin's childhood, where the air was somehow brighter, but she was unable to fit Valentinov in there either. Then she returned with a progressively more detestable burden. Here and there, in the midst of Luzhin's youth, were islands, his going abroad to play chess, his buying picture postcards in Palermo, his holding a visiting card with a mysterious name on it. She was forced to go back home, puffing, triumphant Valentinov, and to return to the firm of Veritas like a registered package that had been dispatched to the undiscovered address. So let him remain there, unknown but undoubtedly harmful, its terrible sobriquet father. On the way to her parents, walking arm in arm with Luzhin along the sunny frost-touched street, she said that within a week outside they should be on their way, and before this she could definitely pay a visit to the forlorn grave. Then she had outlined the schedule for the week: passports, dentist, shopping, a farewell party, and on Friday a trip to the cemetery. It was cold in her mother's apartment, all it had been a month ago, but none the less cold, and her mother kept wrapping herself in a remarkable shawl with pictures of peonies amid verdure on it. Twitching her shoulders with shivers, she did so. Her father arrived during the dinner, asked for some blood, and rubbed his hands with a dry, rushing sound, and for the first time Miss Luzhin noticed how sad and empty it was in those echoing rooms. She noticed that her father's jollity was forced as her mother's smile, and that both of them were already old and very lonely, and did not like poor Luzhin, and were trying not to refer to the Luzhin's impending departure. She recalled all the horrible things that had been said about her fiancé, the sinister warnings, and her mother's cry, "He'll cut you up into pieces, he'll burn you in the stove," and the net result had been something very peaceful and melancholy, and all smiled with dead smiles. The falsely swaggering peasant woman in pictures, the oval mirrors, the Berlin samovar, the four people at the table. A lull, thought Luzhin that day. A lull, but with hidden preparations. It wants to take me unawares. Attention, attention, concentrated, keep watch. All his thoughts lately a bit of chess nature, but he was still holding on. He had forbidden himself to think again of the uninterrupted game with Tarati, and did not open the cherished numbers of the newspaper, and even so he was able to think only of chess images, and his mind worked as if he were sitting at a chessboard. Sometimes in his dreams he swore to the doctor, with the gay eyes, that he was not playing chess, that he had merely set out the pieces. Once on a pocket board and glanced 2 or 3 games printed in the newspapers. Simply for lack of something to do, and even if these lapses had not been his fault, but represented a series of moves in general combination of skillfully repeating an enigmatic theme. It was difficult, extremely difficult to foresee the next repetition in advance, but just a little more and everything would become clear, and perhaps a defense could not be found. But the next move was prepared very slowly. The lull continued for 2 or 3 days. Luzhin was photographed for his passport, and the photographer took him by the chin, turned his face slightly to one side, asked him to open his big mouth wide, and drilled his tooth with tense buzzing. The buzzing ceased, the dentist looked for something on a glass shelf, felt and rubber-stamped Luzhin's passport, and wrote with lightning-quick movements of the pen. "There," he said, hanging over a document, which 2 rows of teeth were drawn. 2 teeth bore inked little crosses. There was nothing suspicious in all this, and the cunning lull continued till Thursday, and on Thursday Luzhin understood everything. Already the day before he thought of an interesting device, a device which he could perhaps foil the designs of the mysterious opponent. The device consisted in voluntarily committing some absurd, unexpected act that would be outside the systematic order of life, thus confusing the sequence of moves planned by his opponent. It was an experimental defense, a defense, so to say, at random, but Luzhin, crazed with terror and the inevitability of the next move, was unable to find anything better. So on Thursday afternoon, while accompanying his wife and mother-in-law around the stores, he suddenly stopped and exclaimed, "The dentist! I forgot the dentist, nonetheless." "Sorry, nonsense, Luzhin," said his wife. "Why, yesterday he said that everything was done. Uncomfortable," said Luzhin, and raised a finger. "If the feeling feels uncomfortable, it was said that if it feels uncomfortable, I should come punctually at 4. It feels uncomfortable. It is 10 minutes to 4. You've got something wrong," smiled his wife, "but of course you must go if it hurts. Then go home. I'll come round 6. "Have supper with us," said her mother with an entreaty in her voice. "No, we guests have this evening," said Miss Luzhin. "Guess whom you don't like." Luzhin waved his cane in farewell, and climbed into a taxi, bending his back roundly. A small maneuver, he chuckled, and feeling hot, unbuttoned his overcoat. After the very first turn, he stopped the taxi, paid, set off at home at a leisurely pace, and here it suddenly seemed to him that he had done all this before, and he was so frightened that he turned into the first available store, deciding to outsmart his opponent with a new surprise. The store turned out to be a hairdresser's, and a lady's that wanted that. Luzhin, looking around him, came to a halt, and a smiling woman asked him what he wanted. "To buy," said Luzhin, continued to look around. At this point he caught sight of a wax bust and pointed to it with his cane. An unexpected move, a magnificent move. "That's not for sale," said the woman. "20 marks," said Luzhin, and took out his pocketbook. "You want to buy that dummy?" asked the woman unbelievably, and something else come back. "Yes," said Luzhin, began to examine the waxen face. "Careful," he whispered to himself. "I may be tumbling into a trap." The wax lady, look, her pink nostrils. This also had happened before. "A joke," said Luzhin, and hastily left the hairdresser's. He felt disgustingly uncomfortable and quickened his step, though there was nowhere to hurry. "Home, home," he muttered. "There I'll combine everything properly." And he approached the house. He noticed a large, glossy black limousine that had stopped by the entrance. A gentleman in a bowler hat was asking the janitor something. The janitor, seeing Luzhin, suddenly pointed and cried, "There he is!" The gentleman turned round, a bit swarthier. which brought out the whites of his eyes, as smartly dressed as ever. Wearing an overcoat with a black fur collar and a large white silk scarf, Valentinov strode toward Luzhin with an enchanting smile, illuminating Luzhin with a searchlight, and in the light that played on Luzhin, saw Luzhin's pale, fat face and blinking eyelids. And the next instant his pale face lost all expression, and the hand that Valentinov pressed in both of his was completely limp. "My dear boy," said radiant Valentinov, "I'm happy to see you. They told me you were in bed, ill, dear boy." But that was some kind of slip-up, and in dressing pup, Valentinov pursed his wet red lips and tenderly narrowed his eyes. "However, we'll postpone the compliments till later," said he, interrupting himself, and bit on his bowler with a thump. "Let's go. It's a matter of exceptional importance, and delay would be fatal," he concluded, throwing open the door of the car, after which he put his arm around Luzhin's back and seemed to lift him from the ground and carrying him off and plant him down, falling down next to him onto the low, soft seat. On the jump seat, facing them, a sharp, yellow-nosed, yellow-faced little man sat sideways, and his overcoat collar turned up. As soon as Valentinov had settled and crossed his legs, he resumed his conversation with the little man, a conversation which had been interrupted with a comment, and now gathered speed in time with the accelerating automobile. Caustically and exhaustively he continued to bawl him out, paying no attention to Luzhin, who was sitting like a statue that had been carefully leaned against something. He had completely frozen up and heard the remote, muffled Valentinov's rumbling as if in a heavy curtain. For the fellow with the sharp nose, it was not a rumbling, but a torment of extremely biting and insulting words. Force, however, was on Valentinov's side, and the one being insulted merely sighed, looked miserable, picked at a grease spot in his skimpy black coat, and now and then, an especially trenchant word, would raise his eyebrows and look at Valentinov, but the latter's flashing grace was too much for him, and immediately shut his eyes tightly and gently shook his head. The bawling out continued at the very end of the journey, when Valentinov softly nudged Luzhin out of the car and got out himself, slamming the door behind him. The crushed little man, continuing to sit aside the automobile, immediately carried him off. Although there was lots of room, he remained dejectedly hunched up in the little jump seat. Luzhin, meanwhile, fixed his motionless and expressionless gaze on an eggshell white plaque with a black inscription, Veritas, but Valentinov immediately swept them further and loaded down to the armchair club variety that was even more tenacious and craggy than the car seat. At this moment someone called Valentinov in an agitated voice, and after pushing open a box of cigars into Luzhin's limited field of vision, he excused himself and disappeared. His voice remained vibrating in the room, for Luzhin, who was speedily emerging from his stupefaction, it gradually surreptitiously began to be transformed into a bewitching image. To the sound of his voice, to the music of the chessboard's evil lure, Luzhin recalled, with the exquisite moist melancholy peculiar to the recollections of love, 1,000 games that he played in the past. He did not know which of them to choose as to drink. So, sobbing his fill of it, everything enticed and caressed his fancy. He flew from one game to the other, instantly running over this or that heart-rending combination. There were combinations pure and harmonious, where thought ascended marble stairs to victory. There were tender stirrings in the corner of the board, a passionate explosion, and the fanfare of the queen going its sacrificial doom. Everything was wonderful, all the shades of love, all the convolutions, mysterious path it had chosen, and this love was fatal. The key was found. The aim of the attack was plain. By the implacable repetition of moves, it was leading once more to that same passion which was destroying the dream of the life. Devastation, horror, madness. "Ah, don't," said Luzhin loudly, and tried to get up. But he was weak and stout, and the clinking armchair would not release him. Anyway, what could he attempt now? His defense had proved erroneous. This error had been foreseen by his opponent, and the implacable move, prepared long ago, had now been made. Luzhin groaned and cleared his throat, looking about him distractedly. In front of him was a round table bearing all albums, magazines, separate sheets of paper, and photographs of frightened women and ferociously squinting men. And on one there was a white-faced man with lifeless features and big American glasses hanging by his hands from the ledge of a skyscraper, just about to fall into an abyss. And again came the sound of that unbearably familiar voice. In order to lose no time, Valentinov had begun talking to Luzhin while still on the other side of the door, and while the door opened, he continued the sentence he had begun. "Shoot a new film. I wrote the script. Imagine, dear boy, a young girl, beautiful and passionate, in the compartment of an express train. In one of the stations, a young man gets in from a good family. Night descends on the train. She falls asleep, and in her sleep spreads her limbs. A glorious young creature. The young man, you know the type, bursting with sap and absolutely chaste, begins literally to lose his head. In a kind of trance he hurls himself upon her. And Valentinov, jumping up, pretended to be breathing heavy and hurling himself. He feels her perfume, her lace underwear, her glorious young body. She wakes up, throws him off, calls out. Valentinov pressed his fist to his mouth and protruded his eyes. The conductor and some passengers run in. He is tried. He is condemned to penal servitude. His aged mother comes to the young girl to beg her to save her son. The drama of the girl. The point is that from the very first moment there in the express she has fallen in love with him, and seething with passion, and he, because of her, you see that's where the conflict is, because of her, he is being condemned to hard labor." Valentinov took a deep breath and continued more calmly. "Then comes his escape, his adventures. He changes his name and becomes a famous chess player, and it is precisely here, my dear boy, that I need your assistance. I have had a brilliant idea. I want to film a kind of real tournament where real chess players would play with my hero. Taradi has already agreed, so has Moser. Now we need Grandmaster Luzhin, I presume," continued Valentinov after a slight pause. during which he looked at Luzhin's completely impassive face. "I presume he will agree. He is greatly indebted to me. He will receive a certain sum for his brief appearance. He will recall at the same time that when his father left him to the mercy of fate, I was generous in selling out. I thought then that it didn't matter, that we were friends and would settle later. I continue to think so." At this moment the door opened with a rush, and a coatless, curly-haired gentleman shouted in German with an anxious plea in his voice, "Oh, please, Dr. Valentinov, just 1 minute. Excuse me, dear boy," said Valentinov, and went to the door, but before reaching it he turned sharply around, rummaged in his billfold, and threw a slip of paper on the table before Luzhin. "Recently composed it," he said. "You can solve it while you are waiting. I'll be back in 10 minutes. He disappeared. Luzhin cautiously raised his eyelids. Mechanically he took the slip, a cutting from a chess magazine, the diagram of a problem. Mate in 3 moves, composed by Dr. Valentinov. The problem was cold and cunning, and knowing Valentinov, Luzhin instantly found the key. In this subtle problem he saw clearly all the perfidy of its author. From the dark words just spoken by Valentinov in such abundance, he understood one thing. There was no movie. The movie was just a pretext. A trap! A trap! He would be inveigled into playing chess, and then the next move was clear. But this move would not be made. Luzhin made an abrupt effort, and baring his teeth painfully, got out of the armchair. He was overwhelmed by an urge to move. Playing with his cane and snapping the fingers of his free hand, he went out into the corridor and began to walk at random, ending up in a courtyard and thence making his way to the street. A streetcar with a familiar number stopped in front of him. He boarded it and sat down, and immediately got up again, and moving his shoulders exaggeratedly, clutching at the leather straps, moved to another window seat. The car was empty. He gave the conductor a mark and vigorously shook his head, refusing the change. It was impossible to sit still. He jumped up again, almost falling. The streetcar swerved and sat closer to the door, but here he could not keep his seat. And when suddenly the car filled up with a horde of schoolboys, a dozen old ladies, and 50 fat men, Luzhin continued to move about, treading on people's feet, and finally pushing his way to the platform. Catching sight of his house, he left the car on the move. The asphalt swept by beneath his left heel and turned and struck him in the back, and his cane, after getting tangled in his legs, suddenly leapt out like a released spring, flew in the air, and landed beside him. 2 women came running toward him and helped him to race. He began to knock the dust from his coat with his palm-down hat, and without looking back, toward the house. The elevator proved to be out of order, but Luzhin made no complaint. His thirst for movement was not yet slaked. He began to climb the stairs, and since he lived a very long way up to his ascent continued for some time, he seemed to be climbing a skyscraper. Finally he reached the landing, took a deep breath, crunched the key in the lock, and stepped to the entrance hall. His wife came to the study to meet him. She was very red, and her eyes glistened. "Luzhin," she said, "where have you been?" She took off his overcoat, hung it up, transferred it to another hook, wanted to fiddle about some more, but his wife came up close to him, moving in an arc around her. He went to the study, she following. "I want you to tell me where you've been. Why are your hands in such a state, Luzhin?" He strode around the study, cleared his throat, and walked through the entrance hall into the bedroom, where he commenced to wash his hands carefully in a large green and white bowl entwined with porcelain ivy. "Luzhin," cried his wife distractedly, "I knew you weren't at the dentist. I just called him." "Well, say something." Wiping his hands on a towel, he walked around the bedroom, looking woodenly in front of him just as before. He returned to the study. She grasped him by the shoulder. Instead of stopping, he went to the window, drew the curtain aside, and saw many lights gliding by the blue abyss in the evening, made a munching motion with his lips, and moved off again. And now began a strange promenade, Luzhin walking back and forth through the 3 adjoining rooms as if in a definite objective, and his wife was now walking beside him, now sitting down somewhere and looking at him distractedly. Occasionally Luzhin would go into the corridor or look into the rooms whose windows faced onto the yard, and again reappear in the study. For whole minutes it seemed to her that perhaps this was one of Luzhin's ponderous little jokes, but his face bore an expression she had never seen before, an expression solemn perhaps, but it is difficult to define in words. But as she gazed, his face felt a rush of inexplicable terror, and clearing his throat and catching his breath with difficulty, he still continued to walk about the rooms with an even gait. "For God's sake, sit down, Luzhin," she said softly, not taking her eyes off him. "Come, let's talk about something. Luzhin, I brought you a toilet case. Oh, sit down, please. You'll die if you walk so much. Tomorrow we'll go to the cemetery. We have a lot to do tomorrow. A toilet case made of crocodile leather. Luzhin, please." But he did not halt, and only slowed his step from time to time by the windows, raising his head, thinking a moment, and then going down. The table in the dining room was laid for 8 people. She remembered that it was just in time for the rest to arrive. It was too late to call them off, and here, this horror. "Luzhin," she cried, "people will be here any minute. I don't know what to do. Say something to me. Perhaps you've had an accident. Perhaps you met an unpleasant acquaintance. Tell me, I beg you. I can't beg any more." Suddenly Luzhin stopped. It was as if the whole world had stopped. It happened in the drawing-room by the photograph. "Full stop," she said softly, and burst into tears. Luzhin began to think things out of the pocket. First a fountain pen, then a crumpled handkerchief, then another handkerchief, neatly folded, which she had given him that morning. After this she took out a cigarette case with a troika on the lid, a present from his mother-in-law, with an empty cigarette pack, 2 separate cigarettes, slightly damaged, his wallet, and a gold watch, a present from his father-in-law, which he removed with particular care. Beside all this there turned up a large peach stone. All these objects were placed on a photograph cabinet and checked if there were anything he'd forgotten. That's all, I think, he said, and buttoned his jacket over his stomach. His wife lifted her tear-stained face and stared in amazement at the little collection of things laid out by Luzhin. He went up to his wife and made a slight bow. She transferred his gaze onto his face, vaguely hoping that she would see that familiar crooked half-smile. And so she did. Luzhin was smiling. "The only way out," he said. "I have to drop out of the game." "The game? Are we going to play?" she asked tenderly, and thought simultaneously that she had to power her face. The guests would be here any minute. And Luzhin held out his hand. She dropped her handkerchief into her lap and hastily gave him her fingers. "It was nice," said Luzhin, and kissed one hand and then the other, the way she had taught him. "What is it, Luzhin? You seem to be saying goodbye." "Yes, yes," he said, fading absent-mindedness. Then he turned and went into the corridor. At that moment a bell sounded in the entrance hall, the ingenious ring of a punctual guest. She caught her husband in the corridor and grasped his sleeve. Luzhin turned and, not knowing what to say, looked at her legs. The maid ran out from the far end, and since the corridor was fairly narrow, a minor hasty collision took place. Luzhin stepped back slightly and then stepped forward. His wife moved back and forth, unconsciously smoothing her hair, the maid muttering something and bending her head, tried to find a loophole where she could slip through. When she had managed it and vanished behind the portiere that divided the corridor from the entrance hall, Luzhin bowed as before, quickly opened the door by which he was standing. His wife seized the handle of the door, which he was already shutting behind him. Luzhin pushed and grasped it together, tighter, laughing convulsively and endeavoring to thrust her knee into the still fairly wide opening, but at this point Luzhin leaned with all his weight, and the door closed. The bolt clicked. The key was turned twice in the lock. Meanwhile, there were voices in the entrance hall. Someone was puffing and someone was greeting someone else. The first thing Luzhin did after locking the door was to turn on the light. Gleaming whitely, an enameled bathtub came into view by the left wall. On the right wall hung a pencil drawing, a cube casting a shadow. At the far end by the window stood a small chest. The lower part of the window had frosted glass, sparkly blue, opaque, and the upper part, a black rectangle of night, was sheened mirror-like. Luzhin tuggled at the handle of the lower frame, but something had got stuck or had caught, and it did not want to open. He thought for a moment and took hold of the back of the chair, standing by the tub, and looked from the sturdy white chair to the solid frost of the window, making up his mind finally. He lifted the chair by the legs and struck unusually its egg as a battering ram. Something cracked. He swung it again. Suddenly a black, star-shaped hole appeared in the frosted glass. There was a moment of expectant silence. Then far below something tinkled tenderly and disintegrated. Trying to widen the hole, he struck again and a wedge of the gas smashed at his feet. There are the voices behind the door. Somebody knocked. Somebody called him loudly by his name in a patronymic. There was silence, and his wife's voice said with absolute clarity, "Dear Luzhin, open, please." Restraining his heavy breathing, Luzhin lowered the chair onto the floor and tried to thrust himself through the window. Large wedges and corners still stuck out of the frame. Something strung his neck, and he quickly withdrew his head in again. No, he could not get through. A fist slammed through against the door. Two men's voices were quarreling, and his wife's whisper wriggled through the uproar. Luzhin decided not to smash any more glass. It made too much noise. He raised his eyes. The upper window, but how to reach it? Trying not to make a noise or break anything, he began to take things off the chest. A mirror, a bottle of some sort, a glass. He did everything slowly and thoroughly. It was useless for him to rumble behind the door to hurry him like that. Removing the doily, too, he attempted to climb up on the chest. It reached his waist, and he was unable to make it at first. He felt hot, and he peeled off his jacket, and here he noticed that his hands were bloodied, and that there were red spots on his front of his shirt. Finally, he found himself on the chest, which creaked under his weight. He quickly reached up to the upper frame, now feeling the thumping of the voices were urging on, and that he could not help but hurry. Raising a hand, he jerked the frame swung open. Black sky, thence, out of the cold darkness, came the voice of his wife, saying softly, "Luzhin, Luzhin, you remember that farther to the left was the bedroom window. It was from there that a whisper had emerged." Meanwhile, the voices that crashing behind the door had grown in volume. There must have been around 20 people out there. Valentinov, Tarati, the old gentleman with a bunch of flowers. They were sniffing and grunting, and more of them came, and altogether they were beating with something against the shuttering door. The rectangular night, however, was still too high. Bending one knee, Luzhin hauled the chair onto the chest. The chair was unstable. It was difficult to balance, but still Luzhin climbed up. Now he could easily lean his elbows onto the lower edge of the black night. He was breathing so loud that he deafened himself, and now the cries of the door were far, far away, but on the other hand, the voice in the bedroom window was bursting out with piercing force. After many efforts, he found himself in a strange and mortifying position. One leg hung outside, and he did not know where the other one was, while his body would in no wise be squeezed through. His shirt had torn at the shoulder. His face was wet. Clutching with one hand at something overhead, he got through the window sideways. Now both legs were hanging outside, and he had only to let go of what he was holding on to, and he was saved. Before letting go, he looked down. Some kind of hasty preparations were under way there. The window reflections gathered together and leveled themselves out. The whole chasm was seen to divide into dark and pale squares, and at that instant, when Luzhin unclenched his hand, at the instant when icy air gushed into his mouth, he saw exactly what kind of eternity was obligingly and inexorably spread out before him. The door was burst in. "Alexander Ivanovitch! Alexander Ivanovitch!" roared several voices. but there was no Alexander Ivanovich. About the author, Vladimir Nabokov was born in St. Petersburg on April 23, 1899. His family fled to Germany in 1919 during the Bolshevik Revolution. Nabokov studied French and Russian literature at Trinity College, Cambridge from 1919 to 1923, then lived in Berlin 1923 to 1937 and Paris 1937 to 1940, where he began writing mainly in Russian under the pseudonym Sirin. In 1940 he moved to the United States, where he pursued a brilliant literary career as a poet, novelist, critic, and translator, while teaching literature at Stanford, Wesley College, Cornell, and Harvard. The monumental success of his novel Lolita in 1955 enabled him to give up teaching and devote himself fully to his writing. In 1961 he moved to Montreux, Switzerland, where he died in 1977. Recognized as one of this century's master prose stylists in both Russian and English, he translated several of his original English works, including Lolita, into Russian, and collaborated in English translations of his original Russian works. That was The Defense by Vladimir Nabokov. I'm sorry I read it so fast at the end. I had a problem with the video part before this where I had to edit it, and I had to make sure that this last video was in one video and not two. Some things I wanted to mention were, there's the reoccurring theme again of somebody being betrayed by somebody throughout your life, or for a good significant part, at least. So, in this case, he's betrayed by Valentinov, taken in almost like adopted by him, pretty much, and then betrayed in a way because he's basically used for his skill. Even though his own father also, in a weird way, was also using him, it was from opposite sides. So with Valentinov, it was with evil intent. With his father, it was for the intent of his own success, but also for the success of his son, so it was actually with good intent. Oddly, even though his wife, before they're married, is very understanding and kind toward him, it's when she does marry him and he has his sort of breakdown, or shutdown, she really becomes really no different in a way from her own mother, even though through also kind of like opposite means. Like, her mother's more evil about it, her father's more kind of like understanding, but still kind of on the side of her mother. But she herself has the same feeling at that point, and for the rest of the novel, that he must be gotten under control in some way, that he should be coddled, that he's not meant to be treated the same way as anybody else. And you can see that you know, he's got plenty of difficulties navigating social life, but at the same time, what he's talented in most, like, wrenching that away from him does seem especially cruel, in my opinion, to do something like that altogether, like saying, no more of this, like you're a child or something. It just seems wrong. But you do see the parallels between a lot of the characters, and also the parallels between the people in his life and what's going on in his mind as he's looking at all of them. Like, they are part of the game, and his whole life is a game. So it's very fascinating, and there's also the recurring theme of suicide in both this one and other books later on. in Nabokov's books. Very interesting. This was, I think, the first of his books to mention falling to death as a means of suicide, or falling as a means of injury that would eventually lead to death. Interesting, because Vladimir Nabokov had a dream about falling, and later on he did fall and sustain injuries that ultimately led to his deathbed. So it is interesting that his books, I feel like, in a way, in different ways sometimes, echoed his own life, or they seemed to foretell certain things. It's interesting too. I also wanted to note the mention of Maschinka and Alfirov. It seemed like from Mary, and then there was the thing about it seemed like there was a mention of Kurt. Kurt was mentioned. I think Kurt was the name of Dreyer. Although they had him being drunk, like a drunk guy in this one. I found that interesting. I don't know if he just reused those names, or if he was intentionally throwing in like little hidden hints at the previous books. But also the mention of the man who is young looking at the woman in the train and just avidly falling in love with her. That too seemed like a sort of like echo of King, Queen, Knave, which was the book before The Defense, which also had to do with kind of game playing. So very interesting. Anything that you may have noticed through the book, feel free to write your observations in the comments. Again, I'm sorry that the last part I sped reading, but I had to in order to complete this part and it be in one video instead of two separate videos, so that I could edit properly the previous video to this one. So thank you for listening.